For Professor Laffan, what would you consider to be the most significant mistake made by the British government in terms of playing into the hands of Sinn Fein in the period from the 1916 Rising to the December 18 general election?
Michael, the most significant blunder made by the British government in assisting Sinn Fein between the Rising and the 1918 election. Sounds like an A-level question.
Well, I've mentioned two of them, and both of them were obvious blunders to make. The British could hardly have done anything else than execute leaders. They executed, after the Rising, they executed some of the wrong people. They certainly executed most of the right people from their point of view. It was a blunder, but it was a necessary blunder. It was an unavoidable one. And in a way, the British response was rational, moderate, sensible. The Irish response to what the British did was bizarre. Why should the Irish regard it as so outrageous to execute rebels when it was the normal pattern throughout the world? A blunder, but an obvious one. Far more significant, because less necessary, I think, was its unwitting, casual destruction of the Home Rule Party in the course of the negotiations in 1916. Another blunder, I mentioned it already, conscription, an obvious one. The British naturally and rightly put winning the war ahead of dealing with any problems in Ireland. Ireland came way down the list of priorities, and from the British point of view, inevitably so. It was damaging from the point of view of the British in the long run, but it was a natural mistake to make. I think, looking ahead, a blunder that wasn't so natural was responding too late to the IRA's attacks, not responding until the summer of 1920 in a serious way, and then overreacting, sending in troops that were undisciplined, that appalled even their own supervisors, as I mentioned, appalled the Prime Minister by their conduct, thereby losing the propaganda war for Britain. So rather than look at the first two that I mentioned, the executions and conscription, I would be inclined to go for a later one, the delayed escalation of the war by the British, the form that escalation took, which was so damaging to Britain's interests in the world, damaging to the British government in Britain itself in terms of public opinion, and damaging in the respect, in the way in which it antagonized the Irish people. So that attitude of that delay and that overreaction and that reliance on crude force, I think would be the most significant blunder, because it was the least necessary blunder. But my colleagues here may very well disagree.
Yes,
go ahead?
I think I'd probably go for the conscription one. If you just look at the membership of Sinn Fein, the volunteers coming them on, the way it peaks in 1918, in March, April, May 1918, as a result of the threat of conscription. And as Michael said, was it Carson who told them they might as well conscript Germans as the Irish, because it would have resulted in bringing so many soldiers back from the front to enforce conscription that they would have had a net loss at the front. So I think my vote is for conscription.
Like Michael, I'll take the easy route and split my vote, but with respect to, I would concur with conscription being a key part. Just bear in mind the time of the conscription crisis also coincides with the release from prison. So you have all these men released. You have also the impact, because you don't have immigration, and that whole question of displaced young men or disenchanted young men and young women as well. But the conscription crisis served as a binding agent between what was left of a remnant of the Irish Party, the Catholic Church, and Sinn Fein burgeoning right to the top. So you had all these things coalescing, providing a unified front that contributed to undermining British policy. But I will also say, for your spare time reading, grab hold of the records of the Irish Situation Committee in the Cabinet and those meetings in 1920, in May particularly, April, May, that formulate the reprisals policy. And you start to contemplate, I mean, you're talking about the burning of Cork City in 1920. You're talking about the burning down of Balbriggan, the town of Middletown, Malbay, in County Clare. Marie's alluded to the attempt to burn down the smaller village of Banley in County Longford. This is the empire burning down cities in a place it claims to govern. It's the ultimate admission of frustration, is it not? So from that standpoint, you look at what that does in terms of the wider impact towards British policy with this government, de jure or not, in terms of courts. You look at issues involving land courts and British rule being completely undermined. McSweeney is arrested, I remind you, in Cork for presiding over a Labour resolution meeting between Ford Motors and the workers of Cork, who were not using the British judicial system. They'd come to McSweeney to settle a strike. That is a fairly damning statement of British rule. So in terms of the breakdown of British rule and what is happening in 1920, there's a lot going on that is undermining the capacity for anything resembling governance or right to claim to govern Ireland.
While the mic is moving around, could I possibly have a second bite at that cherry?
Yes, of course.
And back to the conscription crisis.
See, I'm winning.
No, I'm not backtracking at all. I'm not backtracking.
I'm in the middle.
Remember that Ireland was treated with kid gloves by the British government. Conscription was imposed on England, Scotland and Wales, not on Ireland. Ireland was let off, and anti-Irish feeling was growing. When the British increased the conscription age in Britain to 51, and married men and single men all recruited into the army, anti-Irish feeling was enormous. Why should the Irish, who had shown themselves so treacherous in the Easter Rising just 2 years ago, why should they be let off? Why should it only be English, Scots and Welshmen who were sent off to be killed? And Lloyd George had to take account of that. And it made passing the raising of the age for conscription in Britain easier if he was able to say, OK, Ireland is now coming into the net. Again, Ireland, a minor factor in the considerations, not only because of the threat that the Germans would take Paris, but also because of British public opinion, which had to be placated. Sorry for going on so long.
No, just 2 points. It's interesting that when conscription was opposed by nationalist Ireland, there was also unionist reluctance in the north to sign up, because there was a feeling that the nationalists would resist in all Ireland, and therefore it would be the UVF and people of a unionist cast of mind who would be sent to the trenches compulsorily in 1918. And the other thing is, I'm reminded of Churchill's comments on the executions, because, of course, Churchill was out of office after the Dardanelles fiasco. And he said about the executions, grass grows quickly over a battlefield, but never over a scaffold, which reminds us of the impact of the executions, even though they might have been expected in response to a rising against one's country in time of war.